I'm going to do what he did, which was to go back historically, and I will start with the colonial era. This is not to say that all our problems are attributed to colonialism, but, and this is something that we've talked about with Darius Okola on this channel, there were different economies during the colonial era, and because of certain historical circumstances, the alternative economies started to shrink, and eventually the colonial economy became the dominant one. So what was the structure of that economy? The European mind basically operates in hierarchies. So it was a hierarchy, just like European society. At the bottom were Africans, whose job was to do all the work and produce. And then all that they produce is taken by the Europeans, mainly the British settlers and the colonial administration, and then exported as raw material to the UK, to Britain. And then Britain processes those goods and sends them back for sale here. So Africa was not only a place for the labor to produce the raw materials, but we were also a market for those raw materials. But also the other dividend was guns, that guns were being brought here to support the colonial administration in keeping Africans down to accept this hierarchy. In between the Europeans and the Africans were the Asians. The Asians were brought mainly from India, and there was two benefits that the British were intending to get from bringing the Indians here. One was that because the India had been colonized before us, there were certain skills like for building the railway, trading, and all that, which the British felt that the Asians could bring to Africa. But the second thing is more important, and this is a tactic that was used all over Africa. The colonial powers were bringing people from Asia, Syria, Lebanon, to come and sort of be a buffer between Africans and the Europeans. And the idea was, if Africans start to get annoyed about the oppression, they will now hit out at the Asians and not see the Europeans who are ordering this structure. And Europe still uses that model today. Like in the US, you can see right now as elections heat up, they are blaming immigrants. But really what's happening, as I will say more later, America is deindustrialized. Its people don't have jobs. So when people see immigrants being brought to pick fruit and do other small jobs, then they get angry and they're not realizing that these people, just like the Indians, also came from a colonized territory. In the case of South America, they have been invaded by the US. And so because of those social problems, they come to look for a better life in the US. So it's the same thing that was happening in the colony. Now, I've basically indicated that Kenya and Africa was just seen as a place for, as a source for raw materials. So there was no production expected, it was just raw materials. Now, this bargain that the Asians would be a buffer between the Europeans and Africans didn't work, because eventually some Asians joined forces with Africans in the fight for independence, and especially those who were organizing in the unions. And in the 1960s, Europe had already been beaten hard by the World War. They were starting to see that their imperial ambitions were too expensive to maintain, and so they decided to pull out and hand over to Africans. And they really organized to make sure that the people who are left in charge of the country think like them and will rule like them. So at independence, what kind of society do we have? The British ensured that now the different classes were not only racialized, but now they started mixing up the colors. So the middle class, the middle that was occupied by Asians, now started being occupied also by Africans who had been to school and had become civil servants, they had become traders, and they were becoming professionals. During colonial rule, it was very difficult for Africans to have businesses, because even credit, I'm not sure of the details, but Africans couldn't even get access to credit unless they got help quote unquote, from Mzungu who signed off the loan because supposedly Africans don't know how to manage their money. And this was one of the things that made Jaramogi fight against colonial rule. So now the middle class was colored. It was not just one race. It was also, it included Africans who had got access to education, to business, and to government. And then now the Europeans were now replaced, so mostly by Africans. Of course, some Europeans stayed because Jomo persuaded them to, but now the elite class was mainly Africans. These were people who had been given advantages. They had been working for the colonial government. And then during the Lancaster agreements and those negotiations, the British ensured that the only people who got to the negotiation table were people they could work with. So we entered independence with this group of Africans who had special privileges and were getting a lot of land, getting access to business, making the laws, getting access to foreign capital and all that. And now, instead of us sending our produce to just the UK, it was also going to other markets, other global capital markets. And then, of course, there was the IMF to cushion us from when our elites mismanaged the economy. Now, one thing I need to also add is that another thing that affected production, and this is something that Darius mentions, is that Africans are now, because of the Swinnerton plan, when the Mau Mau war started, the Swinnerton plan now said, okay, let's integrate some Africans in the cash crop economy, because before we were not being allowed to grow cash crops. So cash crops becomes a way of improving people's standard of life. But you see, the problem with cash crops is that they do not produce food. So our food production is reducing. We are increasing cash crops so that we can have access to the cash economy. In that sense, even though the whole system remained untouched, we were disincentivized to really pay attention to the system because a lot of people's lives were improving if they went to school or if they grew cash crops. But most of all, the government, with help from the US especially and the UK, ensured that any alternate views or any questions about whether the economy was what we wanted were crushed. So especially in the universities, many lecturers were detained or exiled so that they could not ask those questions. And in the sessional paper number 10 of 1965, which laid out Kenya's plan for development along capitalist lines, Jomo Kenyatta wrote in the foreword that we don't need to talk about what Africa needs. Let's stop talking, let's develop. And Uhuru used to repeat those lines when he became president. So the population is growing. Production is not growing commensurate or at the same pace as population. And then we have more people entering the cash economy than ever before. And so we basically have an unsustainable model of the economy, and yet we are not being allowed to ask questions about it. This could be maintained until the 1990s. And why do I say the 1990s? I say this because before 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell, the US was really scared of African countries becoming communist. So even if economies were being mismanaged, they were willing to give grants and give support to African governments like Kenya's because they needed us for the propaganda value. But once the USSR was no longer there, then now the IMF and the World Bank now grew some muscle and started pushing for more neoliberal reforms. But it wasn't just here in Africa. Even in the US, through deals like NAFTA, the US deindustrialized. And what does that mean? Because they didn't want to deal with workers who are in their factories, who are asking for better wages, maybe even leave, healthcare, and all that, they decided to shut down their factories, move them to countries like Mexico or even in Asia like Bangladesh. And that way, they don't have to do the work of dealing with workers and their pay and strikes and all that. All they do is that they let the factories in those countries deal with that thing. All they want is the product to sell back in the American market and, of course, in the global market. In other words, they were no longer interested in making money from production. They wanted to make money from money. And let me give an example of what that means. Suppose I am an American clothing manufacturer called Jibambe Fashions, and I'm selling my clothes in the US. When now the Berlin Wall falls and communism falls, I decide I don't want to pay American workers better. I don't want to bother with their pay I don't want to bother with strikes when I refuse to give them money for leave, because I just want to make more money without having the trouble of dealing with workers. Let me take my factory to Bangladesh. So I close the factory, and then I arrange with a Bangladeshi factory owner to make my clothes. And what the Bangladeshi owner pays me is for using my Jibambe brand. So they make the clothes. I dictate the standards because they're using my brand, but I am also renting out a name. I'm renting out my brand. How that Bangladeshi person makes my clothes is really none of my business. It could be a sweatshop, which is a fire hazard. 300 workers can die, but so what? That's not my problem. That's a Bangladeshi problem. And, we'll moan a little bit here and there, but people will forget and they will send me the clothing I want for sale across the world. So it's basically a laziness. Okay, capitalists have always been lazy, but now they had an extra excuse to be lazy. They didn't need to work. They didn't need to understand anything. They didn't need to know workers. They didn't need to deal with their issues. All they needed to do was to wait for the money to come and let other people deal with those problems. What that means in Kenya is this. Now, let's say after 1963, it's Kenyans who are growing tea. So the farmers grow the tea, they sell it maybe to the auctioneers, and then the auctioneers now sell it to the global market. Now, as an American investor, I don't even care to be an auctioneer for tea. What I want is to capture all the auctioneers. In other words, I don't want to be the one bothering with our farmers getting paid, how are the tea factories operating, are there roads, all those things. I don't want to bother with them. I don't want to bother with how the auctioneers are buying the tea. All I care is that I make money from the auctioneers. So what I do is that I bribe the government to do some legislation, some regulation. I control the seaports. I hope I'm getting familiar, the airports, the railway stations. I control the whole network so that the people who buy the tea from the farmers have to bow to me, either through law or through basically monopoly. So what is happening with capitalism is that it's getting lazier and lazier. It doesn't want to do the work. It doesn't care for the human beings doing the work. What it just wants is money from money. So they capture the people making money rather than the people actually doing the work. And then, of course, because America, they were left with the weapons manufacturing, if any government says, no, I don't want this deal, you send guns and mercenaries and you overthrow the government. This was now what was happening when Kibaki came into power. Kibaki came with the proper neoliberal economy. But you see, because it was such a different thing from what Moi left, there was a feeling, especially in the professionals who were able to enter government and make money very quick, there was a feeling that the economy was doing very well and had improved. But we all know in 2007, it became obvious after the elections that this neoliberal arrangement was not benefiting everybody. And in fact, there's a really good article by Pasalelo Kantai called The Ridiculous Generation, where he gives a story of somebody who was from middle class, for whom even then the Kenyan dream, the Kenyan neoliberal dream was not working. So what happens in 2013 after the new constitution with the two presidents who, by the way, both fought against the constitution? In fact, Ruto fought against the constitution because he said it's not allowing capitalism to thrive. It wasn't capitalist enough. That's what he said. So what happens when the two guys enter State House? Before I go to that, one of the things we have to understand is that this group at the bottom, the African majority, is a very volatile group. Once they figure out that their lives are not going well or they are being conned, they are going to take up arms and they are going to revolt. So we saw that during colonial rule that culminated in the Mau Mau War of Liberation. Then now people start clamoring for change even after 1963. Just today, I've discovered that there was a mutiny in Nakuru in 1960, was it 64 or 65, which was crushed by the British government. And then there was the coup, but it wasn't just the military. There were many ways in which Kenyans were saying this arrangement is not working for us. So how do you pacify people to keep them quiet? Under the Kenyatta, the Jomo, and the Moi regimes, they could use detentions, censorship. You know, those days there was only one radio station. There were very few newspapers. So you could limit the education to make sure people are not talking to each other. You can use tribalism. You can use the media because you have only one media house. It was fairly easy to control Kenyans and to crush any rebellion. But that starts to change in the 1990s when everything is liberalized. So by 2007, those tactics could no longer work. So how does Uhuru start his presidency? What was his strategy of keeping us quiet? In 2013, when he was campaigning, he decided to use the ethnic card that his father had used. Because he was the son of the first president, he could pull it off. He could say, oh, you know, anti-colonialism, oh, we fought for freedom. And then the other thing that happened was because of the ICC indictments, he had the perfect excuse to make it sound like voting for him was an anti-imperialist vote. And so he kept on bringing up the Mau Mau. And you see, because we have not yet dealt with the legacy of Mau Mau and the issue of land, it's still a very raw spot for many people from Central Province. So for him to use that was basically reviving a trauma. But he also revived the feelings of, yeah, we were the ones who fought for independence. So if you want to vote against anti-imperialism, and which is embodied in the ICC, vote for me. The second thing he used was ethnicity. He used especially two lies. One is the idea that the former Central Province voting bloc is the voting bloc which you cannot win without. I'm not convinced, but he created the narrative of the tyranny of numbers, pushed it through Mutahi Gunyi, looking very professorial and very clever, crunching numbers. So he does that, and Kenyans are convinced that the reason why he eventually got the presidency is because the whole voting bloc voted for him. The thing is, nobody ever questioned those numbers except AFRICOG. AFRICOG were the only people I know who really questioned whether you can win the presidency on the Kikuyu vote block alone. But everybody bought it, even those who said that he rigged the elections. They basically believed that story, that Kikuyus can vote for nobody else, and that there are so many that it doesn't matter. The rest of Kenya can never outvote them. I don't believe it. But that narrative, and I need to talk about narratives here. The thing about narratives, and Kenyans, because we hate literature and we think arts are useless to the market, we don't know the power of narratives. You see, once that narrative was planted before the election, what happens is that now the vote tally is massaged to fit that narrative. And if you don't dispute the narrative, if you stick only to the numbers, it's very difficult to win. You can go to court, you can complain how these people rig, but the fact that you don't have the story, it means that you're most likely to lose. And that's what happened in 2013. In fact, even Godek was there saying, yeah, Africa maturing, we are not yet, Kenya is one of the leading lights of democracy, but they're not quite there yet. They're still trying to be democratic, but, they are challenged by age-old rivalries, meaning tribalism. So there was no counter narrative to that one. And that's why even after going to court, even after what, the US embassy backed that story, and then Uhuru became president. But the other thing about this ethnicity, which is very manipulative, is the use of guilt. Guilt to say that any problems if the Kikuyus don't vote for anti-imperialism, if they don't oath, and if they don't mutilate themselves, then they are offending their ancestors. So that narrative had a hold on people, partly because this was the son of Jomo doing it, because his father had an oath ceremony, I think in 69. So all those memories were weaponized to make sure that there's a voting bloc that feels they have to vote for him. And you know what is even worse, now that talking of narratives, who came up with the narrative? It was a British PR firm. It was a British public relations firm that came up with that tyranny of numbers narrative and anti-imperial narrative, the irony. So you see, these politicians know that narratives matter. That's why they're telling you that, oh, the arts don't matter. What are you doing literature for? It has no relevance to the market. Of course, it has no relevance because they need to weaponize those narratives against us. So that's how he survives the next two terms, by weaponizing, exploiting his bloodline, weaponizing the traumatic history of the 50s, of the emergency, and also talking about anti-imperialism. That said, how was he going to fund the projects that he promised the majority? Because remember, he was saying, I will bring you maendeleo no matter where I come from. It doesn't really matter. Now, what he did was that he used loans. He borrowed and borrowed. He flouted financial policy, borrowed, built toys like the expressway and SGR that sank a lot of money but brought no benefit to Kenya. That's how he pacified us. And then did a lot of PR and photography work to say that GOK works. I can't remember that hashtag they were using. And then remember production. We are producing less and less. There's climate change. We can't rely on agriculture. There's a new generation of people who have grown up in the cities. The economy in terms of production is not expanding. So it's going to be a problem. Come 2022 campaign season,